Thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I just might mention that Bob is my senior field assistant. He handles a good deal of work in the office, but he particularly is the one responsible for making sure that we keep in touch with those of you in Calaveras County, Amador County, Alpine County. And Bob came over from the dark side. He used to work for the Sacramento Bee. Jillian is with us for a year. She's part of a program that they have in Washington, D.C., which is called basically the Defense Department's Fellowship Program. We have outstanding men and women in uniform and civilian employees of the Department of Defense, and Jillian is an outstanding civilian employee of the Air Force, and is with us for a year, helping us very, very much. We appreciate the work that she does. And I know Brian Caveney was here. Brian Caveney is my communications director out from the Washington, D.C. office here with us during a part of our August recess. It is not an August vacation, even though I've seen Greta Van Susteren say that and others say that. This is the time that we're home in our districts primarily. I am going to take off a week with my family. I think that's okay. But most of the time we're in the district getting around. I think I have 17 speeches, 3 town halls, meetings in my office, and other meetings around the district, visiting those who are working, those who are attempting to give people jobs, that is, those in the private sector. And one of the things I try and do is to get around and find out from you and them what they think is important, and the messages that ought to be bringing back to Washington, D.C., as opposed to thinking that all the information we have in D.C. and all the decisions that are made back there are somehow cloaked in more wisdom than the information and the decisions that we get from back home. I reject that notion. And so for me, it's very, very fulfilling to be in and around the district. You may have noticed we have a debt problem back in D.C. It was in all the newspapers. We got a big problem. We got a huge problem. And that's one of those particular issues that I would say is benefited a great deal by getting the ideas and the views of people back home as opposed to those in Washington, D.C. Because for too long a period of time, many involved in government back in Washington, D.C. have presumed that we could spend as much as we wanted to spend without regard to how much money we were taking in, and therefore how large the debt was, and that somehow there would not be a day of reckoning. Those of us who live in the state of California understand irresponsible spending at the government level and a failure to make decisions, where we're doing the same thing in Washington, D.C. That's the bad news. The good news is, finally, people have noticed. I think they've noticed in large part because what happened in the last election. People have a chance to render a verdict or render a judgment, and that usually is rendered most specifically in a non-presidential year in the congressional election. And I think in the last election they were in a sense nationalized, meaning that the issues on the national level were as important as those on the local level. Meaning that I think people took into account what the leadership would be in the United States House of Representatives as well as who the representative would be. We had one of the largest changes in power in the House of Representatives in the history of the House, or at least the recent history of the House. And that, in my judgment, began the effort or the redirection of where we are going with our government. Just a year and a half ago, the question was how much we're going to spend and how fast can we spend it, where can we spend it. Now the question is, how do we restrain government? Where do we restrain government? How quickly do we restrain government? And can we do it in such a way that the American currency, the American standing in the world with respect to us being #1 in the economies of the world, as to whether and how that would be effective. And so I think that's what's happening right now. We had a couple of interesting things happen. We've had a couple of votes on what are known as continuing resolutions. Those are spending resolutions. They're called continuing resolutions because the previous Congress did not do its work in in appropriating the funds as we normally do in appropriation bills that would cover the entire fiscal year. As a result, they short-termed it, and then you have to have a continuing resolution that allows for the amount of spending that you determine you're going to do for a particular period of time. And the whole reason for that is the Constitution gives the authority to Congress to control the purse. A lot of people think it's the President. Wait for the President to tell us what his budget's going to be. Wait for the President to tell us how we want to spend money. Wait for the President to decide what we're going to do domestically or internationally. Well, he does have certain great powers under the Constitution, but the Constitution precisely gives the power of the purse to the Congress of the United States. And it also, under the Constitution, gives to the House of Representatives the power to initiate any bill that raises taxes, raises revenue. Now the Senate gets around that in a couple of different ways, but essentially the Founding Fathers had that construct of government in mind because they knew members of Congress had to go back to the people every 2 years for their election and therefore would be closer to the people, and therefore they're the ones that would be probably most likely to protect the people's interests with respect to how much we're taking out of your pocket and how much we're spending and how much we're going into debt. A lot of that has been lost in the fog over the last number of years, and I think in the last election there was a strong suggestion by the American people that wanted us to change, and I think you have seen that, at least in the beginnings, over this last 8 months. So we've had some continuing resolutions. We've had some big battles over those continuing resolutions because there is this question as to, are we going to keep spending? Are we going to restrain spending? And so we had some of those early in the year. Then we had this thing called the debt ceiling. What's the debt ceiling? Well, it is the ceiling, or it is the top number by which we allow the government to pay debt. It's sort of like the limit on your credit card. Only in this way it works basically to put the limit on what you're going to spend when it's already been spent. In other words, the bills are becoming due, and the question is, how are we going to pay for them, or are we going to pay for them? We have never in this country refused to pay our bills as a government. I think it'd be catastrophic if we ever said, no, we were just kidding you, we're not going to pay those bills. You're sitting out there with them, and we're not even going to give you IOUs, we're just going to cancel them. So I think ultimately, it's like you're in a family. You got a credit card, or several credit cards in the family, and a member of your family goes out on an irresponsible buying spree. Doesn't let you know about it, but they do. At the end of the month, this bill comes due, and all of a sudden the rest of the members of the family realize someone's not using the credit card in this way. What do you do? Well, I think the first thing you do is you have a family council. That's a nice way of saying you tell them what they ought to be doing with their time and it ought not to be spending money. You take their credit card and hopefully you cut it up. Well, that's what we're attempting to do in terms of these cuts that we're looking at going forward, and in terms of the specific restraints we have on spending going forward, but not going forward 2 years and 3 years from now, but right now. But then you got the bill staring you in the face, and what do? You call up the credit card company and say, oh, by the way, we're not going to pay this bill? How long do you think you could do that? Well, that's what we were faced with. So we had this situation in which we knew the bill was going to come due. The president needed to have some additional authority in order to pay for this. And were we just going to vote for it and allow it to go ahead, as we've done so many times in the past? Or we're going to use this as an opportunity to focus on cutting up the credit card for the future. Again, which had never been done before. And that's what this battle was all about. The battle was, we were going to use our leverage in the House of Representatives. You know, I'll confess, that's what we were doing. We were using our leverage in the House. We only control one, that is the party of which I'm a member, only controls one of the levers. We haven't had the majority in the House. We don't have it in the Senate. We don't have the White House. So we utilized the fact that the president needed our votes in the House to pass the debt ceiling increase. We utilized that as leverage to force the issue on spending. I want to tell you, they didn't want to do it. The president didn't want to do it. There's been no suggestion in the past the president wanted to do it. The history of the Congress, House and Senate, under Democrat and Republican over the last decade or so has been, we want to spend. They want to spend. And so how do we focus this? We basically said we would not vote for an increase in the debt ceiling, and we wouldn't vote for as much as the president wanted. But even what we would agree to, we would not agree to unless several things happen. One, it was not accompanied by an increase in taxes. I think it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to increase taxes at a time when the economy is on its rear end. And I think that's a pretty good description of where our economy has been. Secondly, we said we have to have some specific cuts that begin right now. And those cuts have to be larger than the increase in the debt ceiling. In other words, Mr. President, if you want $900 billion in increased debt ceiling authority, we have to have more than $900 billion in real cuts. And thirdly, we happen to think it's important for the American people for us to be required to vote, to discuss, debate, and vote on whether or not we have a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Now, we can't guarantee it's going to pass because it takes, under the Constitution, 2/3 majority in the House, 2/3 majority in the Senate. Then it has to go to the state legislatures. We have to have a supermajority of state legislatures to pass it in order for it to become law. But it hadn't even been voted on in the House and the Senate for 15 years. 15 years ago, 2/3 vote in the House had passed, missed by 1 vote in the Senate going to the states. And they have, those who oppose it, have done everything they can not to allow a vote even up on it. So we felt that we needed to get that as a condition for our vote. And that's what we got. We approved $900 billion in debt ceiling increase, but we got $917 billion in cuts that start now, not next year, 2, 3, 4 years from now. We got then, where the president wanted more for the debt ceiling, we came up with a crazy construct, but let me explain it to you. If the president's to get $1.5 trillion in debt ceiling increase next year, by I think the spring of next year, we have to in the Congress have more than that in terms of cuts, and the way we do that is they set up this committee. It's not a commission outside the Congress, it's a special committee of the Congress, 6 members of the House, 6 members of the Senate. They have to come up with that amount of money and report to us by the 23rd of November. Then we have to act on that by the 23rd of December. If we don't, automatic cuts go into effect. Automatic cuts on both the domestic side and what they call defense, and they expanded from defense to security, meaning that's DOD, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, intelligence agencies, and the State Department. Now, the way they made it was, they thought those cuts would be so bad for those of us on the Republican or conservative side on defense and protecting the country, that we would fight very hard to make sure that the commission actually works and that we have something that makes sense. And they made it so hard on the liberal side, or the Democratic side, on the issue of domestic spending, that they wouldn't want it, and the pressure would be that we work to have a real set of cuts that are not across the board, but go in to look at the different programs. And then finally, it requires a vote on the constitutional amendment by both the House and the Senate, and if either the House or the Senate votes one up, that is a constitutional amendment, by 2/3 vote, that same amendment, word for word, has to be voted on by the other body. So that you couldn't say, well, we couldn't get together on the 2 different versions of the constitutional amendment. So that's where we're at. Now, some people said, look, you guys on the Republican side, John Boehner came up with this idea, and the numbers didn't jive. The amount he said he was going to cut by isn't the right amount. I don't remember that. And he had to pull back and redo it. You know why he had to redo it? They were working off the numbers that the CBO Congressional Budget Office had given us without calculating what the impact of the cuts that we had in the continuing resolution were. Early in the year, we passed a continuing resolution, and then John Boehner and those of us who voted for it got criticized because they said it didn't match up to the $88 billion that it said. It was only $37 billion. You remember that? So you guys really knew. It turns out what we did had the impact of cutting more than $100 billion. Over $100 billion. So then when we were coming up with the new one on the Boehner plan for the debt ceiling increase, accompanied cuts. We didn't cut as much because we'd already cut that amount, $60 billion more, $70 billion more than we thought we had. So we went back and got more cuts on top of the cuts we got in the continuing resolution. So in fact, we are making progress in that direction. Now you might say, yeah, you guys did all that, but then what was it, Standard & Poor's, one of those big rating agencies, downgraded our credit rating, right? Went from AAA to AA plus. First time that's ever happened. I guarantee you it would have been worse had we not done what we did. And we defaulted on our obligations. I don't see how you would say that our credit worthiness would stand up under those circumstances. But why didn't they respond even more positively to the actions we took? Because they don't trust us yet. I don't trust us yet. As I told some people in the press who asked me the question, you know, is this a great victory? I said, I'll tell you, this is like a 12-round heavyweight prize fight. We just got through the first round. And the American taxpayers are ahead on points, but barely. The question is, what are we going to do in round 2, round 3, round 4, round 5? Are we going to be serious about this, or was this merely a flip back in Washington, D.C. that's not going to mean anything long term? I think that's the real question. Are we serious about getting our fiscal house in order? Now, how does this relate to us here in California? We have an unemployment rate in California that's higher than in the nation. We have an unemployment rate in this district that's higher than the state. Where are the jobs created? Are they created in the government sector ultimately? No, they're created in the private sector. And how do you get the private sector moving? Well, I think one of the things you got to do is you got to create certainty out there. You got to create certainty so that people know they're not going to be taxed in a negative way, such that if I hire somebody today, it's going to be a negative on their payroll next year or 6 months from now. So I think we have to have some absolute recognition that taxes by the government on business can have a negative impact on their ability to create jobs. Secondly, the regulatory mess that we have. When the president wanted to have his a stimulus package saying, remember he wanted all those shovel-ready jobs? And then he kiddingly said at a press deal a couple of weeks ago, I guess they weren't as shovel-ready as shovel-ready was, or we thought they would be. You know one of the reasons why? When they came up with their proposal, I said, look, the only way I would even consider voting for it is if you're going to have stimulus, that is monies that go to infrastructure we know that has to be built. We'll accelerate the building so that actually, right now we'll be doing it. But the only way you can do that is put in an expedited review for environmental purposes. If you're serious about it, that's what you got to do. You got to say, this is so important to us and our economy and jobs that we will have for at least this period of time an expedited review of all environmental concerns so they can't hold up these programs that otherwise we think need to be done, and they wouldn't do it. So if you're serious about that, that's the key, it seems to me, as to whether we really mean what we say in doing these things. So, look, the third thing is how do you free up money in the lending institutions? I mean, they're looking at things the way that we are. They're looking at the uncertainty out there as well. How do you free up the cash that a lot of corporations now have brought in and are not utilizing? You try and get rid of that uncertainty. You try and get the private sector moving once again. And it seems to me that that's what we ought to do. I had an opportunity to introduce Charles Krottheimer. Some of you may have seen him on TV. To a group of students in Washington, D.C. About a month ago. It's a program that we have for our summer interns, and my office, my committee, sponsors it on the House side. So I get to choose those I get to introduce. So I picked Charles Krottheimer and Donald Rumsfeld and a guy named Scalia. You may have heard of him. He's Supreme Court. And Krottheimer said this. He's a brilliant man. I don't know if you've seen him on TV. You may not know he happened to be a quadriplegic. He broke his neck when he was in medical school, and still managed to continue at medical school and went on to become a doctor practicing psychiatrist, which gives him a great insight into the problems in Washington, D.C. Started out as a speechwriter for then Vice President Mondale in the Carter administration, and over time I like to say saw the light. But anyway, he said this. He said, look, some people call President Obama socialist. He said, I wouldn't do that. He said, that's such a broad definition. He said, he is, however, someone who does believe that how they've operated in Europe is superior to the way we've operated here. And he does want to move our country and our governance in that direction. He said he really does want us to be what he described as a democratic socialist government. I mean, that's the kind, if you look at the European experience, oftentimes over the last several decades, that's where they've gone. He said he believes now the huge issue in Washington, and for us to decide, is whether that's what we want to be, or whether we want to revert to what I would consider the idea of American exceptionalism, where we have greater reliance on individuals, greater reliance on private organizations, greater reliance on government at the local level, a greater opportunity for people to express their creativity and bring their ideas forward and take risk, where we have equality at the starting line, not necessarily equality at the finishing line. And the reason is that works for us. That has worked for us better than any other thing we've ever tried, and that has allowed our economy and our society to be more dynamic, more creative, more adaptable, and more successful than others. And he suggested that that's the question that we have before us right now, and I happen to think that is. The other thing I would mention is that Justice Scalia, in opening his comments to the students, said this. He said, what do you think it is that protects your freedom more than anything else in the United States? He said, people will say the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment, First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, so forth. He said, but that's not it. He said, I can show you, in his opinion, he said, I can show you other constitutions and other bills of rights in other countries that are better than ours, just reading. He said, if you ever read the Soviet Union's constitution, you would think they protect their rights better than we do. He said, the genius of our founding fathers was the construction of government, the structure of government created by the Constitution. He said, they can't understand it in Europe. They say, no, wait a second. The House of Representatives passes a law, but it doesn't become a law because the Senate hasn't. Or the Senate passes a law, but it doesn't become a law because the House hasn't. And the two of them pass the same law, and it goes to the President. If he doesn't sign it, or he vetoes it, it's not a law. And then if he vetoes it, it goes back to the House and the Senate, and both of them have to overcome it by a 2/3 vote. He said there are parliamentary systems over there, and they say, wait a second, how does your system work? In order to be Prime Minister of England, you have to be a member of the legislative branch. There's no separation between the legislative and executive branch. He said, our founding fathers created our system specifically so that no man or woman, no faction, no party, or no part of government could be so powerful that they would diminish the individual freedoms that we have. Now, I think that's a great insight for a couple reasons. One is, I'm frustrated continually in Washington, D.C., because they don't see things the way I see it. We didn't cut as much as we need to cut. We didn't bring taxes down as much as we need to, in my judgment. We didn't give certainty as much as we needed to do. But you know, I'm not there by myself. I'm part of a system that diffuses power so that we don't have such power against you or me or anybody else in this room as an individual. So I'm constantly reminded of that. And now, I might tell you, we've probably taken frustration to a high art form in this last couple of years. And maybe we need to make some final decisions. But I am reminded that our system was set up not to be efficient, that is to make the most decisions most quickly. And I think that's something that we ought to keep in mind. Last thing I'll just say to you before I open up for a few questions is this. How many are old enough in this room to remember Fabian? Fabian Forte, one of the first rock and rollers. My wife and I spent 2.5 hours with him at dinner last night. And I really loved it because for the first time in my life, I got better hair than Fabian. Actually, a very, very nice guy. His son and daughter-in-law have a restaurant in Fair Oaks in my district, and it's called Fabian. And he comes out every once in a while. He's actually out here for his grandchild's 6th birthday, and we managed to have dinner with him. It was kind of fun. He gave me all the insights into Elvis Presley, Frankie Avalon, and Ed Anyway, if you got any questions about that, I'll be trying and answer them for you as well. I know the introduction suggested that I am the congressman at the present time. That is true. Everybody talks about redistricting. I don't know what's going to finally happen on redistricting. There could be a possibility of having a referendum on what they've just come up with, or maybe lawsuits on what they've come up with. But I'll tell you this: this is August of the first year of a 2-year term I have. And frankly, I've got a responsibility to be congressman for this area for the whole 2 years. And we will be representing this area for the next 2 years. And we'll continue to do it. My staff will continue to serve because I happen to think that that's the most important thing. One of the things that really does frustrate me, rarely in the papers and rarely in political commentary do you hear people talk about the job you're actually doing. They're talking about how well you're running this campaign, how much money you're raising, all this kind of stuff. It seems to me we ought to spend more attention as to what do people do once they get in office. So I'll just tell you this, I'm still a congressman from the 3rd Congressional District, which is defined right now to include this area until January 3rd of a year from now. And I will and I will continue to do that. So thank you very much, and if you got any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
Baseline budgeting. Why don't we get rid of that 10% annual increase without any? That would save a lot of money.
Well, I mean, I've heard this argument about baseline budgeting. I'll tell you, there's several ways of looking at baselines, and this is why we fought so hard on the CR continuing resolution. The president had taken the position that the baseline for the future is that spending where we have come to with our spending after HARP, after stimulus, after all those things. Now those are supposed to be one-time rescue packages, whatever you want to call them. Normally what you do if you have that is your spending goes up, it should go down after those programs have spent themselves out, and then your baseline ought to be that. What the president argued is all that additional spending that went to those different programs brought you spending this level, and that's where the baseline ought to be. So that's one of the things we fought about in the continuing resolution. We wanted a quote-unquote baseline of the pre-TARP, extra spending, all of that extra stuff that went on. That's why we argued we'd go back to a baseline year before that. Now, you didn't hear that too much in the dominant media, but that's why we were fighting it out. It wasn't inconsequential. Secondly, when we did the CR this year, and people said, well, you didn't really get 88 billion, you only got 37. We actually put a marker out at 100 billion. The problem was we'd gone through a few months of the year, so it was what we could get for the remaining months of the fiscal year. But the reason why it turned out to be more than 100 billion is that we were able to bring spending down immediately in some areas so that the baseline was reduced upon which estimates were being made in the future. The last thing I'd say about baseline is this. Baseline is what is required of the CBO to utilize when they are projecting future spending. They're supposed to consider what the spending is at the current year, and they're supposed to consider what the laws are as of this point in time. So, right now, the so-called Bush tax cuts are scheduled to expire, which means tax rates would actually go up. They put that into their projections. That's their baseline revenue projections in the future. In terms of automatic spending, that's slightly different than baseline, but what it is this. We have a number of programs that are mandatory spending. I think Social Security could be considered one of them, Medicare could be considered one of them, and so forth, that are based on formulas such that you figure out the cost of the program by the number of people who qualify times whatever they are entitled to under the formula, and that's your budget. As opposed to saying, this is all we can spend, now we're going to figure out how to spend it in between. So that's the reason why we have to tackle the mandatory spending programs, because in the system as they are now, they automatically create an obligation for spending in that year and the future years. So that's why I say we've got to understand we got to take ourselves off automatic pilot and put ourselves in the tough decisions of figuring out what we can afford to spend and when. Yes, sir.
Last Thursday, it was unanimous that no tax increases was the mantra, and since then, I've heard that there's supposedly some millionaires that think that millionaires could be taxed more.
Yeah.
So, if we were to throw another 5% on people making over $1 million, would that accomplish anything? Would that put a dent in the budget?
Very, very small dent. It wouldn't solve the problem. But I would say this, I am supporting a bill that will add a line to your tax return. And it is that amount that I wish to voluntarily give over and above what I need to. I call it the Warren Buffett line. If he wants to give billions back, God bless him. But you know something? And Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, those guys, you know, they go out and they create these foundations to do good. And that's wonderful, but you know what those foundations do? Those foundations exempt that money from taxation so they can spend it in the way they think is right. If they have such great faith in the government, give it to the government and let them figure it out.
Let me read this real quick, because I know you're short on time. I want to thank you again for all of your juvenile help since you've been in your office. It's been phenomenal, helping me through a FEMA mess, and also helping me with Wells Fargo. When Wells Fargo bought out our local bank, community bank, they did not think they had to abide by the agreement, my loan agreement that was in place. And they immediately raised my interest rate to 10%, although I was not late nor had I ever missed a payment. I bought them for 3 years. I went to your office first. We were sent in several different directions for federal regulatory people. Came back to your office and finally got a hold of Oliver, and he did magically get my case reviewed by Wells Fargo, and my interest rate went down to 6%, where it should have been all along. My problem is, it's not only me. Thousands of other small businesses that were had loans with Bank of Lodi, which became Placer Savings, went through the same thing. Many of those people are gone because they were unable to hang on. They took advantage of them, raised their interest rates to where they lost their businesses. This is going on all over this country. The banks are stealing our homes, they're stealing our businesses, and I want my $41,000 back from Wells Fargo. What can we do to get the abuse stopped and the American people get their money back?
Good question.
Well, in terms of legal cases, what we can do is get their attention and have them take a look. I don't think you want them influenced by members of Congress saying, I want you to do this one versus that one or something else. I think that would be inappropriate. I think what we do in your case and others is to say, hey, here are the regulations, here's the law. Someone's come to us, it doesn't look like they're getting a fair shake. You know, take a look at it. And we've done that not in your case, but in other cases. I have talked with both banks and with regulators on this issue, and it's not framed quite in the way that you have framed it, but it is framed in a way of how do we get the banks to be more responsive to the true needs of our communities. And the biggest complaint I've had, I will tell you, is that the regulators have tightened up so much that banks have not been able to lend in ways they think are appropriate. Not that we go back to the days that got us into this mess, but in terms of allowing banks to exercise prudent prudential judgment or trying to figure out, is this loan good? Can this person keep it up? And those sorts of things. So that has not been solved at this point. We still have that going back and forth. Some good news I had was in my district last week. Chase just opened a couple more bank branches. They're opening up 100 in California. They're opening up 200 nationwide. They're the largest single lender to small business in the country. And their CEO came out from New York and was riding a bus. It wasn't plated, however. He shows up in Citrus Heights to talk about this, and I went and I talked to them about small business in my community, and one of the things they told me is they had increased their small business lending in this year compared to last year by 60%. So, you know, I don't want to get in arguments about one bank over the other, but there is some loosening up of capital that I haven't seen before, and I think that's all the better. One of the concerns some of us have is that the same tightening that has taken place with respect to the big banks has been placed on the community banks, and frankly, they're not the ones that got us into trouble, the overall financial institutions. So that's what we're doing on that, trying to work and trying to get them to operate properly under this regulatory regime, not to take us back to where we were, which is, frankly, I think if you could breathe, they got a loan. And if they could turn that loan around within a year and sell it to somebody. Look, I could never figure this out. If you've got 10 bad loans, and then you package them into some securitized document, then suddenly that becomes a good investment. I think that's where we went on it. Yes, sir.
Actually, I work for a local bank, manager of banking camp. One thing we're noticing at the bank level is, you know, there are some things tightening up, like the Durbin Act and things for checking accounts that are tightening banks' ability to create revenue and be able to lend more. What kind of actions are out there right now to increase the ability or loosen some of those things so that banks can begin lending again?
Yeah, if I had the answer, I'd tell you. I can just tell you that we have talked to, not talking about me, but I mean members of Congress across the board have tried to talk with the regulators to have this understanding that we think particularly community banks have a pretty good understanding of the communities they serve, that they ought to be able to make decisions within overall guidelines as to whether or not something will be able to work, and that maybe they have a better idea than somebody sitting in Washington, D.C. Now, and again, this is just what we've had through conversations. It appears that they quote-unquote get it at the Washington, D.C. level, and the question is whether the regional regulators are so afraid to make a mistake that they're tightening beyond what people have expected. At least that's the feedback we've got, and it's not a Democrat or Republican thing. That's what I think we've been able to get in different areas. Yes, sir.
If we have a new startup company that interfaces with the Department of Transportation or FDA, who in your staff do we contact to get some help or advice?
Well, Bob is in this area?
Yeah.
Bob.
Start with me, we'll collaborate with other people on the staff.
I'm asking you for some pearls of wisdom. My name is Josie Martinez, and I run a nonprofit organization called Nonprofit Counselors. And our clinic serves patients who do not have insurance, and that's the reason why we started this clinic. Now, talk about fiscal control. Our clinic has great fiscal control because we have no money. And part of
Sound like the federal government.
well, you know, part of
We can print it though.
Part of the problem is the federal and the state government. We have serviced patients since November 2010, and we have yet to see one nickel of our reimbursement. So we've done everything we can possibly can. We've basically passed 3 on-site visits.
This is with state regulators or federal?
This is both federal and state.
Well, have you worked with us already? Have you tried to work with us?
I've worked with one of your staff, and they were able to get a letter saying that, you know, our number is in the system, but now our number is in the system, but they're not paying. So, I mean, we would be able to generate employment if we can just afford to pay. Our clinic is run predominantly by volunteers. And we have very good vendors who have been very kind-hearted to let us ride the wave. But right now, it's been 8 months, they're not trusting the government to pay us. It's a dilemma.
Again, we'll continue to work with you. You know, I don't know whether I don't know what the holdup is. The state of California has not been, well, we've had experiences in the past before. The state of California hold their payments in certain ways to make it through a particular period and then pays, and so I have no idea whether that's the problem. We'll be happy again to go look further on that.
Yeah, I've already gotten hold of the government as well, so.
Okay.
Well, that's it. He has to leave for his next.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
So